the topic in any case was going to be socialism and populism. The chances are that if I generated a new lecture, it would not be identical to the paper that I gave you. But in any case, I thought that there was a need here to really expand the discussion because a couple of you have been very active, sometimes more than a couple, but the last time I had a feeling that not enough people were. So I thought one good way of actually doing this is doing it in the reverse. But of course, I'm changing my mind a little bit, having read the article by Kevin Olson on populism in the socialist imagination. And I do want to start with a few historical and methodological remarks. And then we turn to my paper and I will let you ask questions. So, but for 5 minutes, 7 minutes, maximum 10, I want to introduce this topic. I know the danger is that the 10 minutes could easily be expanded to an hour, but I'll try to be disciplined and then we'll see how we do. So the first issue I wanted to raise is the historical one. I mean, socialism has been around, according to at least some interpreters, since the French Revolution. Usually it is Babeuf and his Society of Equals that is treated as a forerunner. Interestingly enough, in the article, I keep on forgetting his name, Olson goes to the French Revolution, but starts with Hébert and Marat and their followers, which of course works pretty well for populism, but doesn't do anything for socialism. In any case, since then, through the 19th century, socialism became one of the leading ideologies of the age, competing with liberalism on the intellectual level, though obviously not politically. And then, amazingly enough, given the expectations of socialist thinkers, usually thinkers don't have such historical effect, Marx in this case, obviously, above all, socialism becomes a politically realized project in the 20th century in, I would say, two fundamental versions. Lots of people immediately would complain, I'm leaving out anarcho-syndicalism, council communism, and many other possible versions of socialism. I think very few people would have the courage to deny, though, that the communist version and the social democratic version become the two fundamental political forms in which socialism dominates a great deal of the 20th century, not just on a level of intellectual discourse, where it continues to play an important role, but on a level of political projects embodied also in governmental policy. That's the 20th century, or perhaps the first 3/4 of the 20th century. And then in the last quarter of the 20th century, and in our century now, which is almost a quarter century, in other words, a half a century in all, socialism goes in the background. In other words, it continues to exist, but certainly in politically realized projects, it becomes minor, although not entirely absent, if you think about a regime like the one in Cuba, and in some sense also China, Vietnam, and North Korea too. So it exists politically, but this, compared to its enormous presence in the first 3/4 of the 20th century, it is much more minor. And social democracy too. Uh, uh, I disagree with Olson on this and lots of other things. Social democracy has become something that is no longer easy to represent as a continuation of the socialist project. There are social democratic governments in power in lots of places, but certainly the idea that they continue the socialist project in some version is one that few people would maintain. So when we talk about socialism, this is true for populism too, but for socialism much more, given this long time period. We need to be pretty specific about time periods. When my very good friend Bela Greshkovich, whom I asked you to read and whom you heard in a lecture, talks about similarities between, in his case, communism and populism. I'm not going to go through the list, but it's worth for you to glance at. We mentions things like huge budget deficits and import substitution policies. Well, huge budget deficit is the one that I should focus on for the moment. Then he clearly means the last stage of state socialism in that particular case, in countries like Hungary and Poland, where indeed the budgetary deficits became greater for a moment than anywhere else in the world. But this is in the late 1970s. I don't even think that that would apply across the board to the Soviet Union or to China, where the import substitution model continues and the budgetary deficits never reach this kind of Polish-Hungarian level. But still, what I'm trying to point out is that when he focuses on similarities between populism and state socialism, is the term that I prefer using, he has a particular epoch in mind, which is, for his causal argument, central. But for our topic today, I want to be more expansive, as indeed Kevin Olson is too, and speak about the whole history of the socialist phenomenon for populism to I think it will be necessary to speak about the longue durée as well. So that's the first remark. We have to kind of make up our mind. Are we talking about populism and socialism in one very specific period, or are we talking about these phenomena over a long period of time, which is inevitable? It represents, it will mean an inevitable choice between also theory and practice. There's no real theory of Hungarian and Polish socialism, so-called socialism, in the 1970s or 80s. It's not a theoretical matter. So it's coming close to populism would be on a level of policies, would be simply on a level of policies. But over the longue durée, it is a theoretical matter too. A one-sided one, because socialism has great theorists, whatever one is going to say. Marx is one of the greatest philosophers of all time. Engels is a very, very serious thinker and historian. And there are many others in this tradition, great thinkers. There's no denial of that. Populism produced a few serious thinkers. Interestingly enough, the ones that it did produce have themselves come from socialism, which is the effect of socialism being so theoretical and intellectual in terms of its foundations. But still, some populist theorists, Chantal Mouffe, Ernesto Laclau. I don't know if Margaret Canavan had a Marxist past or not. She's the one I sometimes include in this trio of serious populist thinkers. The fact that we only have three indicates either incredible intellectual poverty or, much more likely, a very different strategy, a very different way of being political, which would not be facilitated by too much abstract thinking. So uh, when we look at the long term, inevitably we're going to look at more theories on one side and practices on the other side. It creates a somewhat weird framework of comparison. But nevertheless, socialism too is a practice. And I solve this problem by focusing on the two theoretical strands, which also have been a practice, if you read my essay, obviously. It's unfair to pick Bernstein and Lenin as the only two sources of models, or the two main models, given the intellectual power of Trotsky. Well, Trotsky comes in through Lenin because Lenin comes around to Trotsky's views on very, many important issues. Let's say to leave out Pannekoek or leave out Goethe or even my former mentor, George Lukács, Karl Korsch, is intellectually unfair because they are really serious thinkers, greater on a level of just intellectual power than any of the populist theorists, I would probably insist. It's unfair, but still, this is, I think, how we need to do it. Certainly, we cannot link populism to every single strand of socialist theory. That would be impossible anyway, impossible to do, because there one will have to do radical and arbitrary selection. So that's my first point that I wanted to make, which is a way of explaining the methodology of my paper, aside from the fact that I wrote about the things that I know, which is the real methodology. There is also some kind of justification for that. The second point I want to make, and I'm already going way over my 10 minutes, but I think you're not going to object, is methodological. The one, I object to lots of things in this Olson piece, lots of things. You know, for example, that whereas I think Leninism is the strand that comes closer to populism on its own, he thinks it's social democracy. And I think exactly the opposite of this, and we can talk about this in the discussion. But my most serious objection is not that. After all, that is a question of how one defines the phenomenon in the first place. My more serious objection to the Olson piece is exactly on this question of definition. He says we don't need to have one. And not only does he say that, which is my friend Federico Finkelstein's claim also, but Olson goes a step further and says it's positively misleading to have a definition because it will make us distort the ambivalence and the ambiguity of the phenomenon. On purely formal logical grounds, I think is full of hot air when he says that. Because without having some idea of what we're talking about, what is it that we're going to call socialist and what is it that you're going to call populist, right? And so my claim would be is that he has an implicit idea of populism as he talks about this phenomena, and an implicit idea of socialism, and he just hasn't reflected on it. In other words, he hasn't chosen to reflect on it and tell us. Now, I also think that he has, in the case of populism, a mistaken idea, because he basically thinks anything that is popular is populist, which is, of course, you're free to do that. Definitions we are very free with. We are obviously able to choose our own definition. But the question is, how useful is it to have that kind of broad definition? Because I think that since the French Revolution, and in some sense, perhaps even the American, almost all political projects call themselves popular and refer to democracy. Yes, there are some exceptions. Some important strands of conservatism would reject the label and actually identify the popular with mass or irrational phenomena. And there are also the National Socialists who tended not to like the term people and prefer the nation. At least the Italian fascists, that is true, because in German the term Volk and Völkisch has been even used by the National Socialists. So almost everybody is popular in their own estimation since the French Revolution. To say that we understand this phenomenon, which after all ought to be a little bit more specific than everything that calls itself that, populist is, I think, a huge mistake. And he's of course not going to actually in his work make this mistake when talking about populism, generally speaking, restricting the term to those who have been called populist by somebody, or who very rarely call themselves populist. But I think this idea is incredibly misleading when you try to analyze the relationship of populism and socialism, because it means that all socialism becomes populist by definition. I mean, which socialists thought that the politics that they wanted to pursue was not beneficial for the people and able to represent the interests of the people best? Of course, this is through the mediation of the proletariat or through the class, but Marx from 1843 on had a concept which he never abandoned of the universal class. I'm thinking of the introduction to Hegel's philosophy of right, or on Hegel's philosophy of right, an introduction, a very short text where he coins the term universal class. We are looking for a class whose interests are really the universal interest, Marx says, and whose needs are radical needs, and thereby representing the needs of all the oppressed, who are most of the people anyway. So from this point on, Marxism is a populism if you're going to interpret it this way. And Olson sees an ambiguity because depending on what you stress, whether it is the universal aspect or the active mobilized aspect, you will move from people to class or from class to people. But this, I think, would lead to a nonsensical inflation of the concept. Marx, to the extent that he has seen populism in his own time, and this is certainly more true for Engels, were quite hostile to it. In other words, to replace the class by the people. In the Critique of the Gotha program, Marx explicitly attacks this. And it's not as if he's inconsistent with other works, because I think that the one element of Marx that one has to certainly insist on is his theoretical coherence and consistency. So there, I think, is a second reason. Second reason for starting with a definition of populism. And the first reason being that you can't help but doing so. And the second is that you're going to overinflate the concept if you don't. If you even refer to everything that has been called populist, the conservatives tend to call everything democratic populist. The economic liberals tend to call everything critical of their views, including Keynesianism, populist. Then you're going to have so many cases and so many differences among them that you cannot do rigorous analysis of any kind. And so that is the basis of my critique. Now, you're free to defend him if you want, but that would be my critique. Now, the problem is that I seem to violate my own claim, rereading my article, not with respect to populism, but with respect to socialism. I see the smile on Barbara's face. I assume she's thinking of exactly that I have not produced a really clear definition of socialism in the beginning of my piece. I just illustrated by two brands which are incontestably socialist, at least classical social democracy and Bolshevism are, in everybody's estimation, socialist. And in that sense, without a definition, I launch into that particular topic, violating what I just said, apparently violating what I said about Olson. Now, here is the reason for the violation is that whereas in the case of John Maynard Keynes, whether he's a populist or not is a highly contestable premise. Whether Hayek thought so is one matter, but surely Keynesian economists don't think so. Although I see Paul Krugman, whom I like a lot on almost everything, occasionally call the politics of social democracy populist. Yes, there are some Keynesians who might do this, American ones, because in the United States, populism has been understood rather differently historically than I understand it. But still, it's a highly disputable proposition, whether Keynes is a populist or not, and for that matter, where the Swedish social democracy is, and Edward Bernstein too, the great example of Olson, whether he's a populist or not, is a highly contestable proposition. We can in the discussion analyze why Olson can think so, why he puts Blanqui and Bernstein together as one thing, as against Marx himself, who's only very ambivalently populist in his view. But to me, the marriage of Blanqui and Bernstein is really an errant piece of nonsense, I would say, if he was here. But since he's not here, I don't have to insult him. Okay, so socialism, I may commit the same error. I don't know if Barbara really thought that, but I interpret your faces here. That's what happens when I see a collection of faces in front of me like this. I do violate it. I don't produce a definition of socialism in the beginning. I thought about this all this morning, by the way, of how I'm going to answer that if one of you in the class asks me. I do have the three fundamental values, right? Following a little bit Axel Honneth's book on socialism, liberty, equality, and fraternity. But you can see that you could be a radical Democrat who does not have a socialist economy in mind at all. I would say Proudhon would come closer to that. You could have an anarchist, surely, who could clearly have those three values and who would not be a socialist in their own understanding or in the understanding of most socialists. So just the values of socialism are not enough. So my trick in the piece is to say that it's a combination of long and short-term strategies that produces the socialist idea in the 19th century. And this combination you find in lots of people. But of course, you have to give content to both the long and the short term. By the way, here is a fundamental distinction with populism. There is surely no long-term program in any populist, right? Any populist writer. Look in Canavan, Mouffe, or Laclau for the long-term program. So the very idea that socialism is a programmatic thing, combining long and short-term program would differentiate it from populism. The trouble is Edward Bernstein, right? Whose most famous line is the goals are nothing. It's the short term, the program, the movement, he called it. The movement is everything. By the way, this is what also seems to like in Bernstein. And the only problem is that it doesn't work for Blanqui and surely not for a lot of socialists before Bernstein, and indeed probably as many after as before. So the combination of long and short-term programs is something that was specifically socialist in the 19th century. The Erfurt program of social democracy, which Engels signed on to, had a combination of long and short-term programs. And the Gotha program, which Marx criticized, had it too, but Marx didn't criticize it for that reason. That was not his objection. So socialism, at least ideotypically, involves a distinction of long and short-term programs, and this is clearly absent from populism. But it is not yet a definition. It is not yet a definition of socialism. I would say, for the sake of today, so that I can maintain a minimum consistency in my own critique of Olson's version of populism, is that socialism is the idea of combining the fundamental values of the radical French Revolution with short and long-term programmatic contents. These contents, however, do change historically, and so we cannot identify socialism with any set of these things. So the short-term goals of socialism have changed, given especially the success of other short-term programs before. And to the extent that we focus on a long-term program, these too must change, not because of success, but because of failure and disaster. Obviously, you need not agree with me, but at least those who come from Central Europe, a couple of people in the class, and even from the Ukraine, as one person in the class, will probably agree that the long-term goals of socialism, as articulated by Lenin, Trotsky, and other Bolsheviks, led to serious political, cultural, and indeed economic disasters and failures. But this, I think, in my mind, does not mean that one needs not reformulate, if one is a socialist, the long-term program. So the short term, I would say, as always, is contextual. And indeed electoral, because in order to even get to something like a longer term, you do have to have political power. And that political power cannot be had except to a limited extent by movements. I would maintain that socialism too should be conceived of as a movement, as a set of governmental policies, and possibly, I am relatively unclear what I think about this, as a different kind of political regime than a capitalist, than a democratic capitalist one. But what the content of these three things is something that, if we want to reconstruct socialism, change. In other words, what a socialist movement does and what it advocates is contextual. What a socialist government will do is in part contextual, and in part depends on the reformulation of the goals. And what a socialist regime ought to be, and I do use the term ought, is one that will very much depend on not just contextual factors, but on the reconstruction of the goals of socialism. So yes, I think it's not a neat definition like I give for populism, points 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but I think I would tentatively redefine socialism in terms, or define socialism in the terms I mentioned, including the values, including a combination of long and short-term programs, and in terms of reflexivity, in other words, learning, meaning that the contents of these programs, long-term, short-term, will change depending on learning experiences and reflection on both successes and failures, of which there are a lot in the history of socialism. There are a lot of successes, very dramatic, right? If you look at the Scandinavian countries, you will see, and even German social democracy or German society, that, and this Olson is right about, socialism has very powerful achievements to its credit. But those of us who come from Central Europe or Eastern Europe know that there are dramatic failures associated with this tradition as well. Okay, I stop. I'm just checking myself. The 10 minutes became a half an hour. Okay. Uh, so now uh, you can do two things. One is address what I just said, and B, address my paper, and C, even defend poor Olson, who has a very different, Kevin Olson, who has a very different conception of this than I have. And you may feel much more positive about what you read in his work than I apparently do. So who wants to start? Yes, Callie, please.
I had a question reading your paper, and I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about including the importance of charismatic leadership and defining populism, and if you think that that's a really integral part of what makes a leader or a movement populist.
Great, wonderful. That is really, now, of course, that's definitional, right? In my case, as I said, definitions can exclude, well, can be based on on different aspects of the phenomenon, ideotypic uh, features, and there are people who leave out leadership. Kesmode and Kaltwasser, Rovira Kaltwasser, leave that out. I think that with the exception of 19th century phenomena, uh, uh, there is no reason for this because we always can identify a populist project once it is in government with a leader. And I would say, aside from the elementary uh, phase, the earliest phase of movements too, there is almost always a leadership figure. Even in the 19th century, uh, uh, I don't know too much about the history of this, but Olson mentions Boulanger. So at least one version of 19th century populism involves a leadership figure. People mention Watson for the United States, and occasionally one of the theorists for for the Narodniki, but still the Narodniks certainly don't have a leader. Interesting, we have populisms in other Central European countries. Does first half of 20th century populism in Hungary have a leader? As far as I can see, not. Uh, and so uh, you can say that historically early phases of populism do not always, as an empirical phenomena, have a leader. Okay, so I'm willing to accept that you could define a phenomena without that. Uh, I think, in general, theoretically, that when you leave out a feature, the phenomenon that is being described might turn out to be in some significant respect different, or different in other respects than just that feature. So it has consequences that there's no single leadership figure. One consequence could be that those populisms never win, right? Uh, they never actually get into power. So even if we can find Hungarian populism of the 1930s without a leader, or the Narodnichestvo without a single leader, or even American populism uh, without uh, without a leader in the 19th century phase, uh, this has costs, and that cost is a weaker access to political power through electoral means. But it is possible. So I would say that that feature is definitionally the one that has been the most contested among my characteristics. Almost no one contests the part-whole idea. Almost no one contests the friend and enemy, which is usually called a Manichaean relationship uh, within society to social opposition. Almost uh, uh, no one contests the the element of irrational appeal, although the person who reviewed our books for a book, the new one with Jean for Oxford University Press, always objected when I said irrational. But if you say charismatic, obviously, in pure Weberian terms, it means something which is not a rational appeal in terms of carefully developed programs and the relationship to interest. Now comes socialism, because I think in your question, I read an interest in how the charismatic part refers to socialism. Well, it is ultimately people who live under state socialism who coined the term cult of personality. I don't know what it was called in Russian, Igor. You can tell me, you're too young to remember the term.
Das Kult личности.
It was coined by Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev. Nikita Sergeyevich did not mean it as a compliment, right? He meant it as part of the attack on Stalinism. It's interesting that he selects this feature because Trotskyism already had bureaucratic deformation available, right? Trotsky, since Revolution Betrayed, criticized Stalinism as really, but he called it Bonapartism, which is interesting, right? In this context, Bonapartism, but based on the domination of the bureaucracy. Not exactly a new class, but it was a quasi-class. And then some Trotskyists actually called it a new class. Khrushchev didn't want to choose that alternative. He was quite an intelligent man. He's a countryman of yours. He was from Ukraine originally, Nikita Sergeyevich was a highly intelligent man. His granddaughter teaches at the new school right now, in fact, so we have a biographical link to him. He was a highly intelligent man, and he knew the critique of Stalinism as based on bureaucratic rule. He did not choose that particular form of criticism for a very obvious reason. He did not intend to radically transform the Soviet bureaucracy. Somebody who never mentioned the term cult of personality within communist rule did criticize the bureaucracy. It was Mao Zedong. Interestingly, cult of personality never appears in Mao's vocabulary, not for accident, as we used to say when we were Marxists, just as Nikita Sergeyevich did not omit bureaucracy for accidental reasons. In the struggle between personality cult and bureaucratic domination, they obviously chose different sides, right? You all know this, right? This is, I'm teaching it in the other class. I'm teaching, poor me, the Chinese Revolution in my undergraduate class. That is really a travesty because I can teach the Russian Revolution and Soviet history, but when it comes to the Chinese, I am really weak. I do it anyway, and of course, you come across immediately this particular conflict between Mao and Liu Shaoqi. Some people even say the conflict is between charisma and the commissar. The commissar is the bureaucratic type. The charismatic type is Mao. Mao is never comfortable with them. They are never comfortable with him. But together, they could actually make a revolution and even rule until disasters began to ensue. So in this sense, the charismatic thing is indeed present, Kali, in the socialist tradition. And there's a little bit of a cult forming around Nikita Sergeyevich himself, which is what Leonid Brezhnev suggests when Nikita Sergeyevich is overthrown through a palace coup. It's interesting, right? Is that they can't stay away from this, and Brezhnev too has that kind of cult of personality around him. I mean, no one can become a Stalin, just as after the death of Mao, no one can really replace the cultic dimension fully of Mao Zedong. And this is, of course, incorporated in tombs and in testimonials all over the place. But it's interesting, right? And Don Lenin, being in a way the founder, was conscious of this danger, and for that reason lived in a tiny apartment in the Kremlin and avoided the term Leninism, which some of his followers would use even while he was alive. Still, the danger was there and emerged soon enough. So I think that the state socialist version is always tempted by this dimension. And in our little countries, I'm looking for Joanna and for Barbara, and I see you. There was certainly always a distinct leader with whom the regime was identified with. Critics always call them the little Stalins, who could be fairly serious reformers, as in a way Gomulka was, and János Kádár even more. So the cultic dimension did not mean that they took over everything from Stalinism. They were more serious reformers than Khrushchev himself. Still, the dimension remains for state socialism. Now, I just don't see it for social democracy. So in terms of my definition, social democracy is never of this type. There are very powerful personalities like Willy Brandt, who is the one who comes to mind immediately, the most talented and the most innovative Ostpolitik, which helped to change our world, is to some important extent the work of Brandt and his closest advisors. So you have very powerful personalities in social democracy. Nevertheless, there's no cult around Brandt. And an idiotic thing like having a Moscow spy on his staff leads the Social Democrats just to replace Brandt. So you can see how social democracy is freer of this. I think that's a great thing, by the way. The Bolsheviks keep on talking about collegial leadership and cult of personality as a bad thing, and never managed to create either collegial leadership or avoid the cult of personality. It's interesting. In this sense, they are indeed more populist. And why is that? Well, because they have to be. I explain in my paper. If you're going to do this thing in a peasant country, then the most standard aspect of classical Marxism, namely the idea of the proletariat as a universal class, has to be avoided. Look at their terminology. I don't know the Russian terms, the Chinese terms, but I know the Hungarian one. The toiling people, the dolgozónép, Barbara. You remember? She's too young, and I don't know the Polish word. She's too young, but reading history, she realizes the toiling people, or the toilers, it's a necessity. I'm teaching the Chinese Revolution, right? Lenin was at least had a country where there were 10% in a highly developed industrial sector. And that 10% participated in the uprisings, much more so in February. In the myth, they created October 2, which was basically the work of an organization and of soldiers, right? But there is also February, which was really very much a working class affair in Russia, February 1917. And so there are workers. Well, in China, there are very few, less than 1%. So Mao Zedong, when he wants to defeat the nationalists, has to create a popular base, and that can only be in the countryside. The Japanese did him the favor of sending him to the countryside because they occupied most of the other country, the rest of the country, but the countryside, some of the remote areas were there for Mao. And unlike the nationalists, he was not urban in his orientation. So he created a peasant-based version of the of Marxist-Leninism. But given that he's doing that, he's engaged in trying to bring together, following Ernesto Laclau, let's say, I would say, dramatic heterogeneity, because the peasantry of China is very heterogeneous. And as Taylor Scotchwell argues, I have no really direct knowledge of this, also atomized, heterogeneous and atomized. And so the idea of bringing them together in a ideology much more resembling populism than classical Marxism is natural. How much then Mao takes from classical Chinese imperial cults and all the rest is another matter. But certainly you can see why the populist temptation becomes greater. And even in the people's democracies, think about the term people's democracy, which is also the Chinese term people's republic, right? Is a populist term.
So I had a quick question. I don't know if this is like a simplistic question or not, but just for you to talk a little bit more on, like, do you think that like the populist movements between like far left and like far right ones like differentiate in like what their goal is? Like obviously, do you think like one side often takes populism as like a form of like a strategy used in, do you know what I'm trying to say? Like if it's a strategy used just to gain like political power in order to implement like a stronger form of government, like socialism or fascism, like, you know what I mean?
It's a great question, not simplistic in the least.
Okay.
Is that, of course, a part of this discussion, presupposition that populism can exist in two versions, right? And the links to socialism are, of course, are going to be on the left, or if you want to put it into my terminology, those populists who use socialism as their host ideology are the ones who come closest to socialism. Your question has a very subtle aspect, though, in their ideas or in their politics. That's the subtlety I detect. Now, you seem to say, and probably with empirical reason, that the populists on the left who choose socialism do it in a way more authentically. I don't know if you said that, but you imply, whereas those who choose ideologies on the populist right are more instrumental. That's my formal way of putting what I take to be a very subtle aspect of your point. Is that true? Is that true? In the sense that the populists on the right are never authentic nationalists. If they were, maybe they'd become fascist, is an implication of one side remark of yours. But in any case, can a populist be an authentic French nationalist without being a fascist? Or an Italian one? And I tend to think, yes, why not? Why not? I mean, these national traditions have many attractive features, their language, their culture, their history. And why assume that a right-wing populist cannot be authentically concerned about saving the French language, saving French cuisine, French culture. I mentioned cuisine because to me that is the most attractive aspect of French culture, but I'm kidding because obviously its literature, its language, all these things have very attractive features. French history, certainly I'm very attracted by in many respects. So why not a right-wing populist being authentically concerned about the erosion, the disappearance, the weakening of those things? And conversely, why can't a left populist be instrumental about the values of socialism, which are adopted as a host ideology? So I think that option is open on both sides: instrumentalization and on the other side, an authentic concern for those matters. I think we do much better in politics on the left if we ourselves do not demonize our opponents, and to understand that, let us say, a Hungarian or a Polish nationalist has some issues about which they are concerned in an authentic and serious way. Right? I mean, uh, uh, you know, a Hungarian nationalist can be a patriot. That is the more attractive way of putting the nationalist matter. Now, of course, a patriot should not be exclusionary in terms of those who want to enter into the national culture and to take it seriously and to even adopt it. Certainly, patriotism is not racism, and patriotism should not be an exclusionary form of nationalism. But I think that the idea that on the right everybody is instrumental. Yes, if you take Donald Trump as the paradigmatic right-wing populist, then it's very easy to say that he's entirely instrumental about everything that he is concerned with. He's not even racist personally, but he uses racism instrumentally. It's pretty obvious. Is he anti-Semitic? Well, I don't think that he personally is anti-Semitic, but he is willing to appeal to groups who are for instrumental reasons. But this is not only possible on the right, I'm afraid, it's also possible on the left. One example would be Carlos de la Torre's favorite candidate, namely Rafael Correa, who has used left-wing ideas in an instrumental way. And then, of course, let's think about the bait and switch populists, like Alberto Fujimori, who used a mixture of left and right-wing populist motives instrumentally. So I think this possibility is there for populism. Are there socialists who are purely instrumental about socialist values? Well, Joseph Vissarionovich Djugashvili, namely Stalin, comes to mind. Was he entirely instrumental? I think if you read his earlier writings, you might have some doubt about that. Very early, even while Lenin was alive, he was an expert, so-called, on the nationalities issue of the Bolsheviks. That was his portfolio, so to speak. And he wrote something on the nationalities question. And he was a strong opponent of Georgian or Gruz nationalism. Was that for instrumental reasons? Well, instrumentally, it was not a great idea in a country that was understood, whose population thought of themselves as being under the heel of both the Ottomans at a certain point and the Romanovs at another point. So it was instrumentally not even a great idea if you're going to organize in Georgia. And yet he strongly believed in it, in socialist internationalism. As did Rosa Luxemburg. Now, I don't want to identify these two figures, but Rosa Luxemburg could attack Polish nationalism with just as much vehemence as Stalin could attack Georgian nationalism. On the socialist side, it's much more difficult to find somebody who is nothing but instrumental. But of course, instrumentalism is an important feature of Bolshevism. After all, you had to win elections when they were still in opposition. And and communist parties engaged in electoral activity, electoral appeals lots of times. And that, of course, also meant concessions to populism. You know, you're going to win an election in France, you had to get some votes outside of industrial workers. If you wanted to win an election in Italy, you better be able to appeal to rural people too. So instrumentalism in the populist form enters into the tradition of electoral socialism. The Social Democrats didn't really do that as much. Okay, they were lucky enough to be in countries where the working class vote was much greater, much more numerous. Okay, so anybody else? Yes, David.
I just wanted to ask briefly about something you touched on in your paper. This is something we talked about before, about how the possibility of like an electoral challenge to a populist in power is a key difference between populism and authoritarianism. And I'm just wondering for you, how do you where do you imagine the line is? Like, how far can a populist in power go to limit the opposition before it becomes like a true authoritarianism?
Well, it's another good question too, but it's really two. The one about the electoral dimension of populism in power. And this is linked to the instrumentalism question, and it's also linked to the charisma question. Because not being programmatic in the sense that almost all socialisms are, even Bolshevism, programmatically proposes land reform when out of power. That's, by the way, a populist dimension, because it's really the idea of small peasant agriculture is not compatible with socialist ideology of the Bolshevik or the social democratic type. But in order to get elected, you make proposals of that kind. Once in power, if you're going to remain electoral, this is the question David is raising, do you still have to remain instrumental? The Bolsheviks were not they were not about to have free and fair elections after the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly. So they saved themselves this particular problem, and it led to lots of disasters subsequently in relationship to the peasantry, even under the new economic policy, not to speak under Stalinism. But if you are going to be electoral, like populists are, you have to bank either on instrumental considerations or on rhetorical, charismatic considerations. And given the fact that populists in power do not have much of a program to begin with, the weight of charisma becomes greater. This is why I think populisms in power are so leadership oriented. But your question is basically implies that leadership criterion may not really be sufficient. It's interesting how Morales and even Chavez lose referenda. So referendum seems to be a better way of testing the popular will than elections, but then at least you got to win them. And they lose referendum. So what happens then when you even lose the referendum that you have? I think that the tendency to fully control elections and to have either no more referenda or to control them, manipulate them, becomes significant in all these leadership populist cases. So look at the factors that have to be taken into account. The weakening of the programmatic dimension, if there was one in the first place. In the case of the socialist populists, there is indeed a programmatic dimension, but it is fueled by, in the late cases, by raw material booms. So what happens if the raw material price dramatically changes, drops, right, on the international market? then there is a very clear programmatic deficit. So can, in this kind of Gramscian way, hegemony make up for well, it's not a Gramscian, it's similar to Gramsci. Can charisma make up for decline of ability to deliver? You can see that in the case of Chavez, it still could. But then a small problem, namely the death of Chavez and his replacement by Maduro, reduces the ability of charisma to do the job. And then comes the stage that you're asking about. Now, you're asking me about thresholds. And ideal, typically, I can say what the difference is, but the threshold is very difficult to actually demonstrate. Somehow we have a feeling that in Venezuela, the threshold has been passed, right? In a sense that is Maduro about to have a free and fair election very soon for anything? And the likelihood is that he's not, in the sense that the threshold that Adam Przeworski indicated, and it remains the right one, when a government can no longer lose an election. That threshold has apparently been passed. Has it been passed in Russia? Has it been passed in Hungary? I would say in Hungary it has not been passed. It will depend in a significant part of the opposition whether the elections coming up will be won or not. Now, if the opposition is idiotic and is unable to unite against an increasingly authoritarian government, then the government will win, but that does not mean the threshold has been passed. When Navalny goes to prison, and even his advisors are being imprisoned one after the other, then perhaps the threshold has been passed. But the threshold is a theoretical one. And in each empirical case, we have to analyze whether it has been passed or not. In case of Morales, obviously has not been passed. Well, no, I don't know. It's a somewhat difficult case because it was a quasi-coup that gets rid of it. So it's not easy to, when a coup, it requires a coup to get rid of a leadership, then of course the threshold has been passed. But we don't know if a coup was required because Morales still had a free and fair referendum on his incumbency, and he lost it. So you have to evaluate in each and every case the possibility of a electoral defeat. But that would be the point. Now, ideal, typically one can say a charismatic leader can always win an election. Would Nelson Mandela have won an election if he chose to run? Of course. Actually, his charisma moves from person to person and allows Tadeu Mbeki and a couple of more presidents to win elections under that borrowed or institutionalized charisma. Would George Washington have won an election if he ran? Of course. So in some cases, charisma can win an election irrespective of the level of freeness and fairness. But, Indira Gandhi, a nice example, very nice example. She has the borrowed charisma of the father. She's a social reformer in some respects. She's doing good for lots of people, but she has created a lot of opposition. She was able to lose an election. Then she was able to win it again. That's rare. I hate that example, not because I dislike her, but because it could mean that Trump could win an election. Right? If one of these leaders loses an election, can that leader come back? We don't know. We don't really know. But in any case, he could lose it. So in the United States, you cannot say that the threshold has been passed to some kind of authoritarian hybrid system. Now, the Republicans imagined that. They actually imagined that threshold has been passed. They were proven wrong. You know, if you have a coup and no one comes, we used to say that of a revolution. You can have a revolution, but no one comes, no one attends. If you have a coup in Washington, D.C., and no one in the rest of the country decides to attend, well, then you're done for, man. Right? There were people who would have attended, but they were a minority, a small minority. Then you have to also add, if no soldiers choose to attend, to have a coup and no soldier chooses to attend, that's a beautiful moment too. I love it. There were a few soldiers in that motley crowd on January 6th, right? They did not come in uniform. It's no good. You got to come in uniform and bring the weapons. Otherwise, you're no soldier. The generals were not very enthusiastic about January 6th. I wouldn't be either if you fired about 6 or 7 of my main colleagues. Right? Charisma is not enough. You also have to be relatively clever. And this guy is also dumb. He has some natural instincts which occasionally lead him to do something which works, but he's basically dumb. Indira Gandhi was very smart. You know, it helps if you're going to do this sort of thing.
Yeah, I have a question about your paper.
Yes.
So in your argument, you show the affinity between populism and, let's say, the revolutionary authoritarian tradition of socialism. And as I understand it, the claim is that populism, as it transitions into the government and regime form, that's when this degeneration happens. But it seems to me that your program, your normative program of what you call radical reform, in fact, that's exactly the same as, in a way, Mouffe's argument in the later chapters of our text. And it seems to me you're avoiding essentially the problem that Mouffe is addressing, which is concerned with the movement and party phase. So let's accept that populism is not the appropriate strategy to come to power, but I don't get a sense for what, in your view, is the appropriate strategy. Just just elaborating on a more concrete and substantive socialist project maybe will not be able to effectively counter a right populist strategy, which, at least according to Mouffe, has electoral salience.
Well, I didn't write a book. I remember this nice book of Andre Gortz called Strategy for Labor. And if I weren't so old, I would be tempted by your proposal to write this up. The most important part of what you say, and I completely agree with it, I didn't say it in the paper, but I completely agree with it, is that indeed socialism could be seen as movement in government, the government. By the way, I don't make that distinction in the paper between in and the, but I would make it now, movement in the and regime. I would say that socialism should be understandable in those terms. And you're absolutely right. I'm reformulating the long-term idea, and I want to break away from revolution because I think, first of all, it's too populist, and secondly, the historical record is too authoritarian. So I put in radical reform, but the goal of radical reform is a regime. So you got me completely right. Okay, so far? That is, I'm representing you correctly. Now, here comes the thing, is that I did not put down the government or in government and the movement phrase, and the party too, right? Remember, we have party. And now with Gene in the book, now we say movement, party, in government, the government, regime. So we have a 5. You know, when you create a stage model, you always have the problem that you start with 2 or 3, And Marxists always were plagued by this. Transitional programs, how many stages? In the end, you put in more stages. So we now got 5. I hope we're not going to have any more. Actually, if you read that, you would give me more, as the Yiddish says, Torahs. That's a Yiddish word for trouble. You would give me more trouble if you read it in the current version, because then you would also be asking me to say something about party. Well, might as well. I might as well. All right. So socialism, too, as I reformulated, ought to have these dimensions, these stages. That's your point. And I indeed don't say much about all of them. So let me go through it now from the bottom up rather than from the top down. Movement. Remember, we wrote in a civil society book lots of stuff about the new social movements. I don't want to change that, because the idea of creating a movement based on a single class or a single category like gender or a single interest like ecology would be a mistake in our time, when you have all this variety of self-mobilizations emerging within civil society and where they can be linked to one another. It's not an original view anymore. At the time when we wrote it, it was among the earlier ones who wrote this way. Rainbow Coalition was Jesse Jackson's term for this. But now there is intersectionality and all kinds of fancy stuff around. No problem. I think that this is the way we have to see the movement phase of any new regime formation, which could be an ultimate goal. And so in that sense, I'm not looking for the one socialist movement, but we have to do with the plurality of what we have, which of course doesn't mean everything. I don't really want to include the white supremacists in my rainbow. Now in Hungary, I'm reading faces, and Barbara, because you're Hungarian, you're the first face I look in a situation like this. What about Jobbik? Right? That is, on the level of movements, of course, Jobbik and us are not the same camp or a variety of camps. But when it comes to the next step, namely winning an election, this actually has come up in Hungary quite concretely. Is the electoral coalition going to be including also what used to be a sort of proto-fascist grouping on the right? I don't know if I'm being unfair, but it seems to be, in my reading, that that's what they were. Now, Viktor Orban came to our help in that case, because he moved himself and his Fidesz to the right and allowed Jobbik to kind of gravitate more to the center. I don't know what Jobbik is at this present moment in Hungary, but in any case, you can't really win elections without the second party in the polls, as they are second or third in most polls. And so the electoral coalition is going to have to include them as well. Hopefully, it will be socializing them more in the direction of democratic politics. It's not impossible. In Italy, when Berlusconi did the same thing that Fidesz did, the neo-fascists moved to the center. And you would hear, I don't know if his name is Gianfranco or Gianni, I think it's Fini, in any case, the last name of the fascist leader. He began to defend liberalism in parliament. So it's not impossible. I don't really know about Jobbik, and I should know more. Barbara will know them much more closely. But this, of course, happens not on the level of the original movement phenomena, but on the level of electoral politics, which then brings us to the party phenomena. Should one aim at the creation of a party if one's politics is based on a political constellation composed of movements? And I don't think that one should now form a party in Hungary or any similar case on the basis of all those who are opposed to this authoritarian regime. We have to recognize, first of all, that parties will be available and needed in the case of a possible new transition, but those parties must also compete against one another. So it is certainly reasonable to unite a left-wing formation for electoral purposes with a group like Jobbik in order to defeat the current government. But we have to know that we will compete against one another once we succeed. And there's nothing wrong with that. It was used to be called United Front or Popular Front. I know the communists have given that a bad name because they've always had a manipulative relationship to them. You know, we have a Popular Front in 1947 in Hungary, let's say, to defeat who used to be the right, the smallholders at that particular moment. But once we win, we'll send our fellow frontists to jail. I mean, that's what Rákosi did. That is not what I have in mind. We're going to maintain the liberal democratic form within which all of us will represent our interests and our goals and our desire for a different than a capitalist regime. But we make the electoral road is not just a one-time thing to get rid of the right and then put everybody else also in jail. It is something we also wish to keep. And that is what happens if, let us say, some people of socialist sentiments enter government in a new popular front. I don't think we're going to use this term popular front. In Hungary, it has a terrible flavor. And even socialism may not be the label. But yes, we will be in government along with others. And we will try to come up with better programs on behalf of our constituencies than Social Democrats have for the last 10 years. That's what happens next. And there, I think the idea that there is a grouping which has an alternative regime in mind is helpful, because that's how you formulate a better program. Now, that program may not win. They may realize only a part of it. You know, the traditional thing was to give the socialists the Ministry of Labor. But we don't want it that way because we don't want to get those who will inevitably lose the debates in the Ministry of Finance and in the economic ministries. We want some serious participation on all levels. That's what I would say if I were a party leader for one of the left-wing groups in Hungary now. We want to enter government together with the others. We want a kind of portfolio that will make a difference and will not allow them to make us the representatives of all the victims of their negotiations. But we want a continuation of the form in which we can lose elections. Because in this sense, liberal democracy will be a component of both the new government's policies and the new regime, because I don't think that post-capitalism is supposed to be post-liberal. I think I made that pretty clear, that it will be a liberal version of socialism that will be the foundation for both a new ideology and for the goals of some left-wingers in this new governmental formation. Well, that would be the book if I wrote it. I don't think that Jean is going to collaborate in yet another book after the tensions of writing a second one now. But at least it's an idea that, you know, for somebody, you know, it would be important. And I think more important than for individuals to write such a book, it would be important for political groups to get together and to ask themselves the question, what is alive and what is dead in socialism? That's a question Benedetto Croce once asked in a famous book. And we have to ask what is alive and dead in liberal democracy. and what is alive and dead in anarchism, and what is alive and dead in patriotism. And yes, to win elections, you have to ask that question about all those things. And in order not to demonize our opponents, if we ask that question about, if we ask, for example, about what is alive and what is dead in patriotism, that even creates a way of speaking to Jobbik in Hungary. I mean, I assume they are patriotic, and their idea of patriotism is not racist anymore, even if it was perhaps at one point. That means they are able to change. And being in government also means to help change others who are together with us in government. I know, Udipta, that was a very long answer to your question, and I don't assume that I can satisfy, what is behind your question. But, that's something that we have to all do together in order to actually figure out what is to be a post-populist politics. I know what you were really asking me is, how much am I going to have to concede to populism if I do this? And that is what I very obviously avoided in my answer. But I think we have to concede leadership. I think we have to concede leadership, the idea of having a leader. Now, Joe Biden is an amazing leader to have because he's an anti-leader type. That's not going to work forever. Barack Obama was fantastic, except that he didn't particularly want to lead. You need a combination of Biden and Obama in the United States. Somebody who really enjoys leading, which is certainly Joe Biden. He loves it. And somebody who has the persona to be like a leader in some ways. But it got to be somebody who does not love being that. So it's a very peculiar kind of person we're looking for. Surely not Hillary Clinton. Surely not anyone even vaguely resembling Trump. But it cannot be Barack Obama, who is, I think, fundamentally aristocratic in his persona. Now, okay, sure, you admire George Washington's withdrawal, but that was then. We are in a different time now. You can't withdraw. You have to, in some ways, lead. And in that case, if you have a little bit of charisma, it can't hurt. So that would be my biggest concession to populism. I don't know if that satisfies you yet, Udipta. I'm trying to think in your head now. Do I have to continue to talk about the people? I don't want to. I don't want to. I think that there's so much difference and heterogeneity in even New York City, not to speak of Budapest, a smaller city. The people of Budapest want this or that. Who the hell knows? Yeah, sure. Everybody wants lower prices, except the shopkeepers, by the way, of whom there are many. Everybody wants better air. Okay, but do we want to pay the cost of deindustrialization? How do we do that? It's speaking about the people in that kind of setting is to me delusionary. Friend and enemy. I mean, of course, it's true that if you have a lot of fascists around, it's easy to have enemies. Right, with my background and my family's history and all the rest, anything that resembles that, or racism or suprematism of one group. But let's think about it. Was the Versailles Peace a bad peace? Not any of you are historians, but I'm willing to say it was. Was the fragmentation of Hungary in Trianon, this is Barbara knows what I'm talking about when I say Trianon, was that a bad thing? Yes. Extremely unfair. We made a Soviet republic in response to it. It just didn't succeed. Well, would it have been a good thing if Bela Kun were the leader of anything? Probably not. He was a disaster. He didn't even have a land reform in Hungary. Think about it, a peasant country where Lenin and Mao, situated in a similar setting, had a land reform on the top of their agenda. Whatever else they did later was terrible with respect to the peasantry. But at least to win, you had to have a land reform. Bela couldn't refuse to even put it on the agenda. Did he want collectivization from the beginning? I don't know, probably. Anyway, you know, the heterogeneity difference means that it's always going to be difficult to actually unite the components of a population. And so the term "the people" doesn't help, does not help. It's an illusion of those who talk about intersectionality, that there's a fundamental identity of interests underlying it all. I don't believe it. I think those things have to be fought out, but should not be fought out in terms of friend-enemy relations. So, constituent.
No, Andrew,
I think that.
Andrew, I accept that.
Yeah.
I accept that that's normatively desirable.
You
That what I accept that what you're proposing is normatively desirable and a good alternative. But the question is whether or not it can defeat right populism.
Well,
how effective it is.
Okay, so here's the thing. Are we going to, normatively, we say what I just said. So when we act politically, are we going to nevertheless say the people, the American people? I mean, Joe Biden does that all the time too, and Barack Obama did it also. So Barack Obama, knowing exactly the same things I know about this, nevertheless did it. So can one avoid that vocabulary? He certainly avoided the friend-enemy relationship, by the way, politically. And that's pretty interesting, right? And Biden doesn't do much of that either. That's kind of nice, right? Is that you have these incredible types on the other side, and yet you're not demonizing them. So it can be done. It can be done. But still, some populist vocabulary will slip in. Am I going to condemn everybody who does it at all? Is that what you're asking? Since it's not my job to organize anything, I can easily promise I will never say the American people want this or that. That's a promise that I will keep. Easy for me, right? In theory. But in practice, would I keep it? I don't know. Has anybody ever kept it in American history? Can you find any American politician? Abraham Lincoln was brilliant, right? So he said three things: for, of, and for, and the. Well, of is easy to keep. We're all from the American people as a whole, right? Even if we're immigrants like me, we are of the people because we understand it as an inclusionary entity. For, well, we can explain that it's complex, right? In other words, some things for the people are not immediately good for them. They don't immediately like it. It's still for them anyway. But by is the populist element, right? By. No, it's not by. It was an election in which Lincoln got 40% of the vote. And then during the Civil War, he never had support of greater than that, because even in the North, there are a lot of people opposed to him, and in the South, uniformly. Yes, he had 92% of African American support. Certainly, they elected Grant, who would have lost the election had the African American vote not been there. So by the people becomes a problem. And even Lincoln, with this wonderful three-part formula, fell into it. But we were elected by the people, but 40% is not the American people. So can you avoid it? All right. Are we done? How are we doing with time? Okay, one more question. Ihor.
Thank you. I have half historical, half speculative question. So going back to your paper on the comparison of, so I will rather question the asymmetry in comparison between two strategies of socialism, meaning social democracy and Bolsheviks. So for Bolsheviks, all three stages of populism apply. So Bolsheviks were at different periods, movement, regime, movement, government, and regime.
Yeah, of course.
But the Social Democrats, to the best of my knowledge, did not come to the last stage.
Yes.
They were either movement, in some cases government. And here comes the speculative element. So if we have a Social Democrats in government, will they inevitably or possibly transform to some kind of similar populism, like cult of personality in Bolshevik case? Or for Social Democrats, the strategy of Bolsheviks does not apply?
A really remarkable and wonderful question and perfect place to end. It's great. Now, of course, they have been in government. The Bolsheviks were not. They had a chance in February. And they have always rejected it. Indeed, they rejected coalition initially, then they included the left social revolutionaries briefly in a coalition after November of 17, but that's the only coalition in Russia they have ever been in. But Bolsheviks, namely communists, because the Bolsheviks become the communists, have served in government in France and Italy. Under Mitterrand, it was briefly in the early 1980s. And they were in Popular Front governments too earlier, I think. So they have been in government, but only in the Soviet type societies and China do they become the government and then transform it into an authoritarian regime. So they fulfill all these stages. That's what you said. So your question is about the Social Democrats. And it's a nasty question, though you don't mean it as a nasty question. It is really a question that Hayek would ask. You see why? He wrote a book called Road to Serfdom. And what's the candidate for serfdom? The New Deal and the incipient Social Democrats of Northern Europe. So what is Hayek thinking? Well, in your terminology or mine, but this is the question you asked, is they will, as soon as create a new regime, they will. And that new regime will be serfdom, right? Poor Edward Bernstein can write Evolutionary Socialism with a very powerful liberal component in his book. It's a great book, everybody should read it. It's called Evolutionary Socialism in English, the presuppositions of socialism in the original title. And liberal democracy, but of course, radical democracy too, cooperativism, associationism, are all powerful in his book. Now, does Bernstein's book imply a new regime? Well, it's a question now how we define the regime level. If define it in terms of the economy, as Hayek first and foremost would have, then it is a new regime. And in this sense, I plead guilty. I think that a post-capitalist regime is desirable normatively. Capitalism should not be the end of history. Should not be. It should not be because no matter how well you run it, no matter how fair you try to make it, irrationalities and inequalities creep back in, and it's not desirable to have those forever. That doesn't mean the market economy should be abolished. In my paper, I make a stress, even for Kornay's relatively hard budgetary constraint. So it's not the end of the market economy. Hayek would have thought it's the end of the market. If the Social Democrats succeed, there would be never again a market economy. They have succeeded in lots of countries, by the way. That's your point, right? And the market economy survives. Indeed, there has been a towards some marketization in the social democratic countries. Good thing, bad thing, we don't have to debate it now. But the market economy survives. On the other hand, whether capitalism has been transformed into something like a managed economy, corporatism, that would be a question of analysis and even of the individual country. In my view, there should be a new economic regime. Now, should there be a new political regime? Because, you know, Hayek implies the two go together. When you call a book Road to Serfdom, you're focusing on the political part, which is not what the content of the book is about. The content of the book is about the economy, but the polemical title is about the polity. And in my view, there should not be a radical break. That's why, if I use the right term, radical reformism, which means you make liberal democracy better, not abolish it. After all, is liberal democracy perfect in its own terms? Are elections based on just two parties that are big umbrellas for every single opinion in society? Is that the best way to run elections? Is liberal democracy that does not have a participatory dimension, does not have sufficient local democracy, as France didn't for a very long time, does not have industrial democracy. So liberal democracy itself could be very much improved. But is that regime change? That's your question. Is radical reform regime change? Or is regime change imply a revolution? Well, I'm learning from the 1989 quasi-revolutions, if you want, is that you could actually have regime change without revolution. And in this sense, one element of traditional regime change, namely revolutionary break, can be bypassed. Does that mean, though, that you will not have a new regime at some point because the increments can mount up? If you have enough incremental change, you could have a new regime. And that's logically possible, right? You know, you can assume that regime change requires revolution. You have to break with the old in one legal break. But it could also mean that you are changing every part of society whenever you have the sufficient support and sufficient political energy to do it. So I think a regime change is possible without revolutionary break. That's Janos Kish wrote an article originally, which we published in Constellations, and I follow him in this. Okay, so yes, that's the answer to you. Social democracy has not yet meant a radical enough transformation of capitalism to be called a new regime, except maybe in Hayek's eyes. But I would advocate it. I would advocate it. But how you do it and how you go forward is another question. And I would say, don't do it through a revolutionary transformation, simply because that would involve unintended effects which might interfere with what you're trying to do fundamentally. But then how to do it, and so that becomes the puzzle. I do this in my revolutions class, basically. I'm sure, given that they're all about 21, 22, I'm not going to convince too many people there of the desire to replace revolution by regime change. But I would maintain the same. I would maintain that. Okay, have fun. And yes, these questions are very amazing. I just have to say that this is really, for me, a great experience. Thanks a lot.